night, everybody. Thanks for being here tonight. I know it's not the most beautiful day outside today. I also know it's the first day of the semester. That also means that is the first Hobart reality check. So, first of all, I want to say thank you for being here tonight. And well, we have an amazing guest. He is Tom Zambito. And for those of you who do not know who he is an investigative reporter for the Journal News. He also has done some work for other news outlets such as The Record, The Star Ledger, and the Daily News. And well, if you want to know more about him, obviously, Professor Nick Hirschon is going to have an interview with him, but also you can ask your own questions using Twitter. We're going to have a hashtag that's Hobart Reality Check. So, whenever you ask your question, you use that hashtag. And well, without further ado, let me introduce first, Professor Nick Hirschon and Tom Zambito.
Thank you, man.
Thank you.
Thanks, man.
Hi, everyone. My name is Nick Hirschon, and I'm an assistant professor of communication here at William Patterson. And I'd like to welcome you to the second semester of our Hobart Reality Check speaker series. The series is hosted by our campus chapter of the Society of Professional Journalists. Maynor, who you just heard from, Maynor Castillo, is our president. And each month we welcome an insider from the news industry to share their insights with our student journalists. Tonight we invite the audience, as Maynor said, to tweet along with our conversation using the hashtag Hobart Reality Check. Again, hashtag Hobart Reality Check, and then later on we'll be able to get your questions up on the screen. So please start doing that as we discuss. And I want to thank Sarah Douglas and Rod Holliday, who are curating the social media conversation for us backstage tonight, and Dr. Rob Quick, our chairman, for arranging for this. So tonight's guest is Tom Zambito. Tom is entering his 33rd year in journalism. He graduated from Boston College in 1985 with a degree in English, and he was a second baseman on the baseball team. His first job was as managing editor of the Queens Tribune in New York City in the mid-1980s, where he worked on a typewriter. After that came stops at the Bergen Record, the New York Daily News, Newsday, and the Star Ledger. He's currently an investigative reporter with the Journal News in Westchester County, New York, which is part of the USA Today network. He's won more than 36 writing awards, among them honors from press associations in 3 states, as well as Investigative Reporters and Editors, the Associated Press, the Deadline Club, which is the New York City chapter of the Society of Professional Journalists, and the Society of the Silurians. So again, please join me in welcoming Tom Zambito to William Patterson University.
Thanks, Nick.
Thank you, Tom, for coming here tonight, especially with the snow.
Sure.
So I just wanted to start with a general kind of overarching question based on your decades of experience that we just went over. What do you think is the key to being a good reporter overall?
Well, you have to love what you do. You have to love the profession because it'll kick you in the head every now and then, as you know. But just a passion for doing what we do for journalism. When I first started out, you mentioned I played baseball in college. That's all I wanted to do. I wanted to be a professional baseball player. Well, my junior year, I realized that wasn't going to happen, and so I took a journalism course and was taught by a guy who was the bureau chief for Newsweek, and just really ignited my passion for it. I wanted to know more about it. I started reading newspapers. I never really had that much. So I started reading, and that was kind of it. I mean, I think the big thing is just a general curiosity, to want to learn more things. I never really did any sports reporting, anything like that, but I was fascinated by news and wanted to know more about it.
Sure. And so we'll definitely get into later advice for student journalists, and I want to hear from the audience if they have questions about it. But I do want to talk about some of your specific experiences, and maybe there'll be some lessons for us in there. So you and I met when you were a reporter for the Daily News, and while at the Daily News in 2001, you reported on the sketchy legal and business dealings of the acting governor of New Jersey at the time, Donald DeFrancesco, and that coverage prompted him to pull out of the race. So that, to me, shows the kind of power that the news media can have. You can write stories that helps the audience make a better informed decision about whether I should vote for this candidate, for example, or not. A real effect on society. Is that something that kind of drives you as a reporter, that idea that what I write could actually have a betterment in society?
It's powerful. The day that when we worked at the news, back then there was no a internet to speak of, really. You know, it wasn't the first place where we went for our news. So on that morning, you wake up and your story's on the front page of the Daily News, and you know it reverberates through the city, out into New Jersey. That's pretty powerful. You know, you walk in, you listen to the radio, and you know they're talking about your story the next day. So it's quite a rush, and it's a pretty cool thing to do, but it can also be very nerve-wracking. You know, you just don't. A story like that is as big as that. You don't want to get it wrong. So you know, there's a lot of sleepless nights before that hits, and the point being is that there's a lot of responsibility that comes with the power, and you really have to, you know, when you do investigative work, you really have to prepare. You really have to work hard, make sure that everything you have in there is you know, the truth. I stay up. I go through. Before I deliver these stories, I go through them line by line, and every line I make sure that it's something I back up. You know, if I've looked at my notes 3-4 times, I go back and look again and make sure that everything I'm saying in there is the truth.
Mm-hmm. Well, and you're just talking about the importance of accuracy, and obviously we live in an era when a lot of people are concerned about fake news,
Right.
And whatever that means in all its different definitions. But do you ever worry now? We're talking about a story you did in 2001 when you probably had a lot of time to report it and get it right and read it. Since you're still a reporter today, is that an issue, having to get it out so fast that you can't check the facts?
It is an issue, but you know, better be late than wrong, right? You know, that's kind of the advice that I've always followed. I really don't operate any other way. It's hard to. I mean, once it's been sort of ingrained in you. But yes, there are certain pressures, you know, with the, you know, getting it out on the internet, particularly at you know, when we were at the news, we're in an environment. I worked in the Manhattan Federal Courthouse where there were 12 reporters in the same room. 6 of us were reporting on the same story every day, and whoever was first, you know, looked best, and whoever, you know, was late, you know, got a call from an editor, or if we missed it. You know, back then you could miss it and you'd have to spend the entire next day following up because you couldn't get it out. You know, you couldn't miss a story and then an hour later come up with your version. The internet didn't work that way back then. Sure. So yeah, the competition is fierce, you know, when you work in New York City. But again, you don't want to be wrong on those stories. So you really, you know, you really have to prepare. You really have to make sure your sources are good ones.
Yeah, and I want to ask you about some of those sources because you interviewed a lot of famous, or some people might say infamous people. At the Daily News, you spent a little under 5 years in the Manhattan Federal Court, and you covered 2 of John Jr. Gotti's federal conspiracy trials, as well as Bernie Madoff's arrest, plea, and sentencing, and the civil sexual harassment trial of former Knicks coach Isaiah Thomas. And you also covered the murder trial of Barbara Sheehan. She was accused of killing her cop husband after years of physical abuse in Queens, New York. So those were a lot of high-pressure situations. You're reporting on the mob, seeking interviews with potential murderers, you know, accused murderers, and the jurors who are deciding their fate. So, you know, especially given our student audience, how do you handle that kind of pressure when you're dealing with someone who could be a criminal?
Yeah, you know, I've been asked that question before, and I don't know. I've never really been afraid. You know, no one has ever really. People have certainly threatened me and said things that were intended to sort of frighten me a bit, but I think they have bigger problems than me. You know, I think if you're dealing with the FBI or me, the FBI is probably a bigger problem. They can put you in prison. I can't. You know, during those trials, you know, Junior Gotti had, you know, when he got me alone, he would blow off steam and, you know, would ask me if I worked for the Daily News or the government, you know, if something didn't come out his way. You know, it usually blew over. You know, and I understood that because, you know, here he is, he's facing, you know, life in prison. That's a lot of pressure. And, you know, to blow off some steam at a reporter, it kind of comes with the territory. So I never took it personal. His mother, too, would, you know, yell at me every now and then. But I think if you have a rapport with people, you can sort of diffuse it. and you have to sort of learn those techniques when people come at you pretty hard, and you know, a good sense of humor can get you a long way.
Mm-hmm.
You know.
So is that the way you diffuse some of those situations?
Some of it,
Make a
yeah,
joke?
yeah. I can remember a point where John was pretty upset with that we were he would go to church in Long Island every Sunday morning, and a lot of times we would send a photographer there and get him coming out, and he just said, you know, can you not come to church anymore? These people in the town where I live, they're really upset at you guys showing up with cameras every Sunday morning. I said, well, I really can't tell the photographer what to do. I said, but you may want to think about going to 5:30 Mass on Saturday, and they'll be there Sunday morning. So he thought that was a good idea. I don't know if he did it or not, but you know, little ways you can sort of diffuse things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so you never felt at any point that you were under threat of your life or injury? They never made any sort of direct threat there?
No, I really didn't. You know, maybe in the back of my mind every now and then, but no.
Yeah. And then you won an award from the Deadline Club, the New York City chapter of the Society of Professional Journalists, for a story that you wrote when you were at the Star-Ledger,
Right.
2013, on the death of a Montclair High School football player who had suffered a concussion in practice and was allowed back on the field a few weeks after that. And I was reading that story and I saw, this is again a point about sourcing, you relied on a lot of pre-trial depositions from a negligence lawsuit that had been filed by the football player's family. So again, from a student perspective, maybe we often think of sources as people
Right.
who you talk to. But how much do you rely on documents as sources, and how do you go about even finding them?
Right. So yeah, that story came, you know, through a lawyer had given us the depositions, sort of spelled out how this young man, his name was Ryan Doherty, and he played defensive line on the JV football team in Montclair. He got hit in the head at a practice and was told not to play. Somehow he was cleared to play, and in the game that he was cleared to play against Bergen Catholic, maybe Bosco, he got hit in the head and went down and never recovered. So courthouses are great places to find documentation. They tell an entire narrative. You've done it, I've done it, dozens of times. If you know how your way around a courthouse, if you can figure out how to get through court files, they're great narratives. I just did a story a few weeks ago that came out of told the story about a derailment, a Metro North derailment where 4 people were killed. Those were mostly court documents. Now, having said that, you take those court documents and you learn tidbits, but you may not learn the whole story. So then you take those paper documents, and there's nothing better than getting a stack of paper or reading through an internet file of, that spells out an entire story, because then they can get you to the human sources. There's names in those things. Then you can, if Nick Hirshon is named, then you can go find Nick, and maybe Nick tells you a, pretty fascinating story to layer on top of whatever the paper is telling you.
Right.
Because usually that's what you find in the court papers is pretty dry.
But then, and with a story like this, I imagine it's very emotional to report too, right? Because when you're talking to the family of someone who just lost their child, and
right.
So how do you handle your own emotions?
Well, yeah, I think the most important thing is you have to realize you're there for the story. Since I have children, I have 2 children, and it is hard for me now to report on some of those things, because you clearly, your mind wanders and you start thinking about your son or daughter. But in a lot of these cases, my training was as a police and courts reporter. And so in those cases, you're constantly talking to victims of crime or the families of someone who was murdered, right? So you're constantly dealing with people in very emotional situations. And you would be surprised that 8, 9 times out of 10, they want to tell their story. They want to you may be the only person they tell the whole story about their son or daughter to, because you're there to speak for them. People say, it's grisly. How could you, how could you possibly go and knock on the door of someone whose son or daughter just died? And believe me, that's a question when you go out into this business. That's a question you'll ask yourself too, if that's what you're forced, what you've been asked to do. But you realize that, this is a life, and the people in that community need to know about a life that was taken away, and the families, more often than not, will facilitate that. They want to tell the full story of their loved one who died.
Right. I mean, there's times when a journalist is almost like a therapist, I guess. They're the first person that they see when they've just been through something traumatic.
Yeah, I mean, very often in situations, you can think about your own personal situations. You know someone who's lost a loved one and you don't know what to say. Mm-hmm. Well, you're there as a journalist, you better know what to say, because you got a deadline and you need to sort of tell a story. And so you need to ask the questions. You need to, figure out how to do it tactfully, and with respect.
Well, when you're talking before about diffusing a situation with a mobster or whoever you're interviewing, is there certain tactics that you used in those situations where something was getting emotional and someone was breaking down, maybe crying? Is there some journalists I know are totally fine with, I'm going to hug this person because that's the human thing to do, and I think I just need to go past that source, journalist relationship. Some people want to keep their distance and still give them a moment, but not cross that boundary. How do you?
Yeah, I've never really done that. I've never really, I have been hugged by, can recall, being in Virginia covering a murder, and a guy came out and was showing pictures of his wife who was murdered, and he hugged us. And, we really didn't know what to do, but no, I mean, you always try and keep that distance. And for the most part, people understand that.
Yeah.
They understand the role you're in.
Is that what you'd say is one of the things that you didn't expect coming out of school, that when you became a journalist, was that something you weren't prepared to handle?
You don't teach a class in that here, do you?
Right.
Like you're confronting,
hostile or traumatized sources. Or,
yeah, it's a talent. It's a strategy that you sort of figure out along the way. I didn't look, I don't want to go up and knock on the door of someone who just lost their loved one, right? It's not, when I wake up in the morning, that's not what I'm excited to do. But I do understand that it's important that, I remember when I was in Virginia, I had to cover a story of a teenage boy who was killed, and came back to my desk, and I probably looked white as a ghost, and my editor kind of saw that it had affected me, and I said, I really didn't enjoy doing that, and I really don't want to do that again. And what he told me then was what I've sort of followed through the years, is that, when someone dies, it's awful, and the community sort of has to share in that grief, and you're the only instrument that can sort of get that story out. Is it difficult, uncomfortable, intrusive? Yes, it is all those things. But I think, when there's, what if we didn't, write about, you have a situation, in Patterson every day, not every day, but very often those things play out, and these people all had lives, they all had stories to tell, and I really think if we abandon those stories, I think it becomes too common.
Sure. Well, and again, after the Daily News, you were at the Star-Ledger when you wrote a series that highlighted problems with how bail was administered in the New Jersey court system. And another result of your reporting, the system underwent dramatic reform after that. And your reporting in that instance reminded me of that famous quote that's sometimes attributed to the journalist Finley Peter Dunn, that the job of the journalist is to, quote unquote, comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. And in this case, the court system would be the comfortable. Maybe they're, I don't know, if they're not doing things the right way and you're afflicting them in some sense. But do you think that that's part of your job, to afflict the comfortable, whether it be politicians, the mob, government, landlords, what have you, authorities, or is it case by case?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's, definitely a role we play. I mean, it's a role played by law enforcement, but to a lesser extent us. I mean, if you go back and look at a lot of the corruption trials in New York State, a lot of those were generated by news stories, people digging in and sort of finding out it's your tax dollars. You know, they shouldn't be going to people who, you know, corrupt the system. So yeah, I think, you know, I think we certainly play a role in that. And, you know, the bail situation in New Jersey was a mess, and it's sort of a long involved story, but essentially what the story was is that, you know, when you, for argument's sake, if you get arrested for murder and your bail is $250,000, well, everybody thinks you have to put up $250,000. Well, it's usually 10% of that. It's $25,000. So that's still a lot of money to make. But what they were doing was they would go to bail agents, and bail agents would put them on like a monthly installment plan. So you'd pay $1,000 for a $250,000 murder, and then over time, you know, each month you would have to come back and kick in your $500 or $600. So you could get out on a $250,000 bail for $1,000.
Right.
So.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and that's part of, again, our job, right, to show people gaps in the system,
Right.
or just very surprising things.
Right.
Remember, again, I'm going to give a little more questions, but make sure you're tweeting out Hobart Reality Check hashtag. And if you have some questions for Tom, I want to get into your time at the Journal News. But before we do that, we were talking a little bit before about, you know, different changes that you've made in your career, and you've obviously been in a lot of different news outlets. And something that students ask me a lot is it worth it to become a journalist these days? Because they hear about the decline of the industry. It's hard to get jobs, and maybe they're thinking that you just go into something else. So you've had your own kind of experiences there, and some of our other speakers have too, and you said you might be willing to share some of that. So
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. You know, it's funny. I have a 19-year-old son who's a freshman in college, and while he was on break, he came up from the basement and he said, Dad, I just watched All the President's Men. He said, that's a really good movie. I said, you said you were going to business school. And but you know, I understand what you're going through, and you really need to be passionate about the business, because it will kick you around. I've been laid off twice, you know, and in just in the last 5 or 6 years. So, and I came back for more. Right? I felt like I wasn't finished. I felt there was more to contribute, and I was hired at the Journal News as an investigative reporter after I was at the NJ.com and the Star Ledger for almost 2 years. And it's been a gift. You know, I'm getting back into doing, you know, more in-depth investigative work, and you know, stuff that we've written about, you know, Metro North and about a dozen people who've died, and the issues with Indian Point and the nuclear power plant out there. And so it's been fascinating, and I've been sort of given you know, latitude to sort of pursue these things in interesting ways, you know, long-form narratives. So I'm learning, you know, like Nick said, this is my 33rd year, but I'm still learning, you know. I learned at tabloids, and now I'm learning, you know, the digital universe, Twitter. I'm not very good at it, but, you know, I get it, you know. I get
you understand
the
that it's important too.
I know it. I'm completely sold on that, yeah. You know, and it's really, you know, we had a meeting today about page views at our website, and, you know, how to generate more page views. You know, once you come into the site, how do we get you to read the second story? So, you know, this is, you know, the language that's used, everything that's used is sort of new to me, in, you know, just in the last 10 years. But you have to be willing to adapt. You guys are probably better suited for the business than I am, without the experience of having done news for years. But digitally and on social media, I'm sure you're far more adept than I am. So you have that advantage coming in. If it's something you want to do it. You know, it's never been hard for me to wake up in the morning and go to work. Never, in 30 plus years.
And so that was kind of, even when you had those low points, you know, layoffs, there was something about being a reporter that was very motivating to you?
Yeah, it's always been what I've done, and you know, I've been on deadline every day for past 30 plus years. So, yeah, and I feel we play an important role. I feel it's it's a way that I can sort of contribute in some small way in society. It's kind of part of who I am. It has become part of who I am. I'm grateful that I can still do it. But it, it's not without its obstacles. It's very difficult. Can be very difficult financially, And the nice part about when you get laid off is you find out who your friends are. You find out even people who the people who helped me the most when I got laid off were people I competed against, and they kind of understood, what had happened, and they, they called people before I even called them, and that was very heartening to me. Of course, my friends helped and all that, but other people came out of the woodwork that I didn't expect them to.
Well, I think that's something that kind of surprised me about getting involved in the business too, is that you end up spending a lot more time with your colleagues at other news outlets than you do with your own bosses sometimes and your own colleagues, because you're out on assignment so often. And you do form those relationships, and you would think that, yes, there is a certain level of competition, like Daily News Post and those kinds of things, but that's maybe on a higher level, and that we see that there's a good fraternity of journalists.
It's I go to scenes now. I don't do it as much as I used to, but I go to scenes, and it's always a blast. You see people you haven't seen in years, photographers, reporters, and it's always, there's a lot of war stories you tell and those sort of things, but it's a friendship. We've been through a lot of different things together, and yes, it's competitive, but it's rare that it's competitive to the point where people act stupid about it. We know how to compete. We know how to be adults, and treat each other well.
There's a shared goal of truth dissemination, and so I think that's
but we also want to destroy the other person every day too. But I don't want my day to start with a call from editors asking me why the Post didn't have this, or why the Post had this and you didn't. That's not a good way to start your day. I would like him or her to start their day that way.
Right. So there's just still some of that competitive.
Yeah.
And you were talking about your transition to the journal news. So that's something that I'd want to ask, because earlier you were saying, your first job you're writing on a typewriter, and now you're talking about social media. So, you came also at a time in the news business when a lot of journalists operated in silos in a way that a print journalist or a broadcast journalist, but not both. You did one or the other. You were a photographer or a newspaper reporter. You didn't do, the reporter didn't take their own photos or anything. But now you're not only writing stories, but appearing in videos on the Journal News website, talking about your reporting, and you've gone on a lot of different TV shows where you've been interviewed about your reporting, such as RNN's Richard French Live. So did you go through any sort of training to become a more broadcast person, or how did that transition work?
No, you just kind of wing it. You go in, and the first 5 or 6 times you're a mess, and you stutter, and you like I am now, and you don't do well because you're not comfortable with it, and you see a camera and you get nervous. But after you do it 5 or 6 times, and then I have a buddy who's an acting coach in New York, and he just tells me make sure you keep your chin up, and that's all he's told me. So I don't know what that means, but you just kind of you try and be comfortable, conversational, and you learn new skills. We'll watch it. You have a great studio here for TV. I'm sure everybody's got TV skills. You learn that. You watch it. You watch how people on TV do it, and you just sort of wing it.
Was that the same thing with social media? Because I know certainly when I was at the Daily News, a lot of our older colleagues were very resistant to learning anything about Twitter, Facebook, or anything like that. And now it's just become dominant.
Well, you see the feedback is immediate, which is nice. You're interacting. A lot of times, when there were just newspapers, the idea was to, particularly if you dropped in an investigative piece, is just to, that there was pickup, that the radios picked it up, the TVs picked it up. Now it's this interaction with readers, which is pretty fascinating, because immediately, like we have a system called Chartbeat that they can tell you when a reader tuned out on your story at paragraph 7, paragraph 8, or did they get to the end. So we're trying to write stories in a narrative way that sort of gets them to the end, right? Because then they stay on the site longer. So every morning I can look at we have a system that I can look in and I can see what the average engaged time for each reader was, right, on my story. And if it's 2 minutes or more, that's pretty good. If it's less than that, some shorter cop stories are, they're significantly less, 45, 50 seconds. That's just an average. But you can see the interaction immediately. You can see where they came in from. Did they come in from Google, Facebook, Twitter? I can see all that the next morning.
Is that something that affects your writing, that you actually think like, well, I have a problem with my 5th paragraphs or something like that? Or how? Because it's a kind of hard thing to implement, right? About like, what do I do with this information?
Yeah, it is. And I don't know that there's a solution. I mean, what you'll realize in the business now is everybody, I've been through, 5 or 6, I've been at 3 or 4 different operations in the last 5, 6 years. And each one has a different theory of, when you link a story inside the copy, should it be link it to 2 words or 5 words? At one place I worked at, they yelled at you if you linked it to more than 2 words. Well, there's no one is showing me any statistics that say it's better to link it one way to the other. So a lot of us are sort of feeling around as to what works because there's not really an empirical understanding of what does work. I mean, there's ideas of what work, and there are good examples of places that work where their digital operation is growing exponentially. But a lot of us are just kind of feeling around for the right formula.
Right. Yeah. And I do have some other questions, but let's see if we can go to some of the Twitter questions from the audience. Again, hashtag Hobart Reality Check, and we'll try to get some of these up on the screen. So, you can feel free if we can just look around and see if there's anything that interests you. But I see a few familiar names from my classes or from our SBJ chapter. So we have SBJ member Juliet Ruiz asking, do you choose your stories or are they given to you?
I prefer to choose my own. And it's not that I don't respect editors, but I always think my ideas is usually better. But I always, when I worked at newspapers, when I started out, you did your daily story, and then you had to have a weekend Sunday story. So that was part of the deal, and you constantly had to come up with ideas. I always feel like when you went out on a story, you have to come back with 2 or 3 ideas. So I sort of feel like I'm failing if an editor is telling me what to do.
Right.
I'm the reporter. I should come up with the ideas.
It's more fun, right? You get to do what you want to do
and you
instead
got
of
to
what
sell
they
it.
say.
Right. You got to sell them on the idea. That's the hard part. Usually, they like their idea more than yours.
Sure,
Yeah.
of course.
Right.
Let's see. Well, Maynard, who's our SBJ president here, said, when covering ongoing stories such as the Indian Point nuclear power plant, how do you keep up with that coverage, and does it interfere with your personal life? And we were talking about that a little bit before. You said that there's events that may be happening tonight, and you're kind of like one eye on the phone as you're even here right now.
Right. There's a strike deadline tonight at Indian Point, so I kind of have to monitor that. I don't have a beat right now that's daily. That, in other words, I have to, have something every day. It's not a lot of breaking news, but I can tell you when I did cover breaking news, yes, it does interfere with your life. Absolutely. I've been on fire scenes in Virginia, and my wife was at a restaurant, and it's, I'll be there in an hour, and then it's 3 hours later. She gets it. She's in the business too, but so definitely it can affect your personal life. My advice is get a court beat because it's 8 to 5, and the judges go home at 3 o'clock on weekends. So.
Or a spouse who works in the industry, right?
Or a spouse who works
understanding.
No weekends in the courthouses. That's good.
Okay, Alex Evans, another one of our SBJ members, says, what makes investigative journalism different from other types of journalism?
Well, there's a higher threshold. In other words, when your editor gives you 2 or 3 weeks, or now it's 2 or 3 weeks. It used to be 6 months, 8 months. You better come back with something pretty good. So there's a higher, the success rate better be high. You can't come in after 2 or 3 weeks and say, I really I don't have anything. It doesn't work that way. You have to deliver. If you're going to get time off to dig into things, you better make sure that what you outlined in that story meeting two or 3 weeks ago better be what you deliver. So you need to do your homework ahead of time, and make sure that you hit all the boxes.
Sure. We have Mark Pereira saying, I'm currently looking to change careers and always want to be a sports reporter / journalist. Do you think at 30 changing careers into journalism will be tough?
Yeah, certainly. It's always tough, no doubt. But again, like I mentioned before, if you love it, and you really want to give it a try, and you're crazy enough to think you can be good at it, yeah, try it. You may not be happy if you didn't. Life's too short, and why not give it a shot? I know, before I came here tonight, I was running out, and I was told a couple of folks I work with that I was going to speak to a college class, and they were like, "Oh, tell them not to do it," and I was like, "No, I'm not going to tell them not to do it, because somebody told me that, my father wanted me to take over the real estate business in Queens, and I went and sat in the office one day, and I was like, there's no way I'm doing this." So I figured out, what I was passionate about, and found a way to do it. And I think, again, it's hard. It'll scare you some days. The financial end will scare you, but if it's really what you want and love to do it.
It's good to hear that in a world where there's so many cynical journalists.
Yeah,
who've been
well,
around
I think there'd be more. I think once the industry sort of straightens itself out, I think there's going to be more opportunities. Mm-hmm. I mean, you see at the New York Times now, right? Their digital subscriptions are through the roof, right? The last few years, there's a lot more interest after this last election. There's a lot more interest in journalism now.
Sure.
Whether it works itself out, I don't know.
Right. Just since you mentioned the election, certainly I want to get right back to the questions, but I did want to ask you briefly about your thoughts on Michael Wolff. So one of the ongoing controversies in the last few weeks has been this Michael Wolff tell-all book about the Trump administration, Fire and Fury. And then if you've been paying attention to the news today, several news outlets reported that he got cooperation from the White House because he kind of misrepresented what the title of his book would be. They said he told the White House that his working title was going to be The Great Transition, the first 100 days of the Trump administration. And that signaled a kind of sympathetic view of Trump, a counter-narrative to the negative news stories that were plaguing him. And so there's been this whole debate now in the industry in the last few weeks. Michael Wolff, is he a pretender? Is he a true journalist? On the one hand, he maybe misled his sources. He didn't really tell people what exactly his motives were, got inside under questionable circumstances. And yet, at the end of the day, is it kind of the ends justify the means? Well, he took advantage of some inexperienced White House staff and got his way in, got all the information.
Inexperienced White House staff, I don't know if they go together. I mean, they're in the White House, so they should be experienced and they know what they're facing. But I get it. There's a fascinating book that Janet Malcolm did. Janet Malcolm's a reporter for the New Yorker, and she did a story about Joe McGinnis and his relationship with his, in the movie, and the book was...
Journalist and the Murderer?
Yeah, she wrote The Journalist and the Murderer, but it was Joe McGinnis's book about the murderer was...
Oh, I don't remember the name.
Yeah, I forget the...
Line something?
Yeah, I forget, but it was a North Carolina murder. Anyway, it explores this sort of relationship between, the journalist and subject, right?
Mm-hmm.
And, there is a point... Yeah, there are lines. I don't feel comfortable doing it. I don't feel comfortable misrepresenting. In fact, I think I get more when I tell them exactly what I'm going to do and say in the story. Like I don't want any surprises. Like if I cover the MTA in Metro North, I tell them what I'm writing in the story tomorrow. I don't, play around with it. I tell them this is what I'm writing, and they can answer me or not answer me. Now, it's a little different in a story that Wolff is reporting and that he needs access, right? So maybe he's telling them, one thing, but I don't know, typically there's trust that's built up between a reporter and subject. I I don't know what the relationship was or what he said or did, so it's hard for me to weigh in on that. But I do know that I've been in those situations before, and I think telling people straight up what you're doing and not lying about it. Because when I covered a courthouse, for instance, if I went to the prosecutor and I said I'm writing one thing and then I wrote something different, well, he's not talking to me tomorrow.
Right.
It's the same thing as covering a locker room, a baseball team, or you name it. If you got to come back to them the next day and they know you just burned them and lied to them, that's a different thing. With Wolff, he's coming in, one shot. Now, it's a little different relationship.
Certainly. And that's been one of the criticisms of the mainstream news media, was that maybe they'd been playing soft on Trump in some ways or not asking kind of tough questions. But as you say, they need to maintain these relationships. They can't just go in really hot and burn their sources because someone like a Maggie Haberman at the New York Times, she needs to worry about whether the Trump administration will talk to her again tomorrow.
Yeah. If she does and she doesn't. I mean, you can also report without them too. You can, there's a lot of different. I covered a county courthouse in Bergen where I wrote something the prosecutor didn't like, and for a year he didn't talk to me, and that made it very difficult. But I wrote stories, around him, and yeah, I mean, it is sort of the balance you need to take with some of these things is, access. I always took the story over access,
Right.
And let the chips fall whether it may. You'd be surprised sometimes people know that you report in a forthright way that they'll still speak to you even if you did hit them pretty hard.
Sure, yeah, and people get over it with time, as you
Yeah,
say.
they
right?
get over it.
That prosecutor got over it after a year? Or?
No, he didn't.
He did?
He got fired.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah,
well, that's
yeah.
why it was after a
Yeah,
year.
that's
Okay.
probably why I stayed on the beat.
So the lesson
I didn't
is
get fired.
He should have kept speaking to reporters, otherwise he lost
Yeah,
his job.
yeah.
Okay, we have some more Twitter questions. Nicole Maldonado asking, what was the most rewarding story that you've covered and why? Most rewarding.
So there was a case in Queens where a young boy had his mother had left him in a bathtub, purposely left him in a bathtub, and the details are a little grim, but the skin, he was scalded, horrifically disfigured by his mother, and it was a very difficult story to report, but he was just a beautiful kid, little kid, and he came in with his father would come into court every day just crying, and the power of the Daily News, we could you write a story like that about this little boy, and people were just, it was around Christmas, and they just there was packages of Christmas toys showing up at our office, and so we brought it out and to this little guy, and that was, you don't get to do that every day, so that was pretty rewarding. That was pretty cool. Have sort of interaction with people who are really in a bad place.
Yeah, there are a lot of moments I feel of the news where I saw it restores your faith in humanity. Certainly when you wrote stories about pets. If there was like ever a dog or a cat in need, God, everybody came out and wanted to help, adopt that animal.
Yeah, it's pet stories. I've written my share of them. Not as many as Lisa Colangelo, but
Yeah, Lisa, who was here last semester as part of the reality check.
yeah, she's the master.
Master of pet stories. Okay, we have Richard asking, coming from someone with a long, successful career in the journalism field, would you say you found more success with your work in the past rather than with the technological advances we have today? So was there more success for you back at the start of your career than you're experiencing, you think, now?
No, I'd say, the last few years have been pretty good. With all the technological advances, I think it makes it a little easier to report. I mean, there's so much available that you can kind of go to and in relatively short time. We don't we don't do as much human reporting as we should, which is often where the best stuff is. I mean, we sort of tend to, I know some reporters that will interview people by email, and I just think that's crazy. I don't, especially if you're writing something that you have to sort of capture, what that person is about. You have to the best stuff is in the room. You have to be there to sort of experience. Conducting an interview is sort of like a ballet. You just don't ask 5 or 6 questions and get out of the room. You need to sort of feel about what they want to tell you. So, as much as this technology helps us, it can also hinder as well.
Yeah, I've been amazed at so many students who want to use Facebook messages and Twitter DMs and sort of those sorts of things as source. And of course, sometimes we all do it, professionals do it too, to try to get a hold of people.
Yeah, I've definitely done it. If I need a quick comment on a story, I'll send something out. But no, something longer, no.
Right. Yeah, I mean, in the ability to describe someone's facial expression, or just especially if you're doing a human interest kind of, some of the stories you're describing that are very emotional.
Right.
It helps, or you're trying to really forge a connection with a source that you've never met.
Yeah.
That can be important.
Right.
Sure. Let's see. We have from Professor Elizabeth Burge here. Were any of your investigations personally dangerous?
Trying to think. We did something at the news about there was a Staten Island ferry. There was a ferry captain who I think was drove the ferry drunk, and I had to stake out a place for days and out in St. George's Terminal, and the guy threatened me once or twice, but I just kind of, again, you use humor, if there's a way to diffuse it, or you just leave. If somebody wants to hit you, that's probably a good time to leave. We did a story on money laundering, I remember, at the Bergen Record, and we knocked on a door, and a guy came out and kind of said, you guys need to get out of here right now. And your instinct sometimes is, well, I'll stay wherever I want to stay, but what was being told to me was I needed to leave, and I did leave.
Smart.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think
that's why I've been to 33 years. Otherwise, it would have been like 16.
Exactly. You wouldn't have made it to the reality check.
Right. Exactly. I wouldn't be here tonight.
But it's good for students to know, and because we do teach, in journalism, right? You want to be persistent, and when someone initially may decline interview, you keep persisting and get information, and then you say stand your ground if someone says you can't be here, you can't take photos here, whatever. But at some point, you got to be smart about it too.
Yeah, you have to be smart about it. If you feel physically, or if you feel it's just going nowhere, what's the point?
Right. Yeah. What's gained from hanging around?
Yeah,
for sure. Okay, we have Thomas DiMartino saying, how does social media influence the way that you write or release your stories? So are you thinking about that?
Yeah. So we like to release stories, the bigger investigative pieces now, for some reason, we release it on Wednesday mornings. For some reason, that's the middle of the week. We think we release it very early in the day, 6 a.m., and we think that the traffic sort of builds between 6 and 10 a.m., and then it'll build up again at rush hour coming home. So yeah, that's one way we sort of gear it. And then we're on Twitter, for instance. I'm connected to, if it's a transportation story, I'll tweet it out to a lot of different transportation groups, commuter groups. Our buddy Jose Martinez helps. Mm-hmm. He's a transit reporter for New York One. Those sort of things.
Yeah. Does it affect the way you actually write? Do you find yourself maybe writing in shorter sentences because it's more appealing to the online reader?
Yeah. No. I try not to. Yeah. I don't. Okay. I try not to. I just think if it's well written, it's I see a lot of poorly written stories. I think that you engage people by writing well. Mm-hmm. I don't think you can get around that.
Sure.
I think that's what the core of this business is writing and writing well, and it doesn't matter if it's on social media or what. You need to do it well.
Right. Yeah.
Because people don't come back if you don't do it well.
For sure.
Right.
That's great. All right. We have. Let's see. I saw Maria Zuniga, who's the vice president of our William Patterson SPJ chapter. What made you want to become an investigative reporter?
Weekends off was the first incentive. After a while, I covered courthouses. I covered, I don't know, hundreds of trials, hundreds of, crimes. And, after a while you want to dig in more. And that was really the incentive that, I wanted to do something with a little bit more heft to it. And so I had a pretty good mentor at the Bergen Record, Jim Hayner, who went on to the Baltimore Sun. And, we spent a year in a room together doing a series on money laundering, and I sort of learned from him. And after that, I sort of got the bug, and a couple of years later, I got a job on the investigations team at the Daily News, where I learned from Joe Calderone, who's at Newsday, and he's also terrific. So, yeah, it's sort of the influence of those people that helped me along.
Sure. And having a good mentor in the business, right, is something that it's probably good advice for a lot of the student journalists here, right? Finding someone at your first internship or job who's willing to actually spend some time with you and sit you down and say, okay, you made this mistake, or here's how we can, they're being positive, encouraging you sometimes when you need it.
Absolutely. I'm still friendly with, my early teachers in journalism. The people who hired me early are, still my friends. But I think that's what when you go into newsrooms today or magazines or wherever you end up, one of the failings, I think, in the current climate is that there's not enough mentoring going on. In other words, you get through, when I came into a newsroom, no one really sat me down and said, this is how you interview someone, and this is the questions you ask, and there wasn't really a textbook, right? But when you sat around 4 or 5 people who were asking questions, you learned how to ask a question. And you heard, and because everything we did back then was on the phone, well, you heard when Nick Hirshon got turned down, and then somebody, a politician or someone, was giving you a hard time and didn't want to talk to you, and you didn't just put down the phone, you figured out another way to sort of get him to talk to you, right? So you learn techniques. And I think that mentoring inside the newsrooms, that doesn't go on as much today, and I think that's a real failing, in the current business climate.
Well, that's some part of the failure of those layoffs, right? Because then all of those veteran reporters
Right.
end up giving way to a lot of young reporters. Is great; they get an opportunity, but they don't have people around to kind of guide them. But
Right. There was always people who were kind of in the woodwork. Sometimes at the news you weren't quite sure what this guy did because he hadn't had a byline in 6 or 8 months, but they were stars, and you sort of listened to them, and you listen to Bill Gallo, who was our cartoonist. He was a great mentor to all of us. People don't realize that. Bill was a cartoonist for, probably 50, 60 years, right?
60 years.
He was a legend, and you would go in and, sit with Bill for a little bit, and he would kind of tell you, how to work, how this crazy business worked, and those sort of people were always around for you, in difficult times and good times, and there are few of them now.
Yeah, well, and that's one of the things that I think we as professors want to always encourage our students is that, your experience doesn't stop right at William Patterson, and that if there's a few years down the line where you're encountering some sort of a crisis, and sometimes, you have moments as a young journalist, is this career right for me? Did I pick correctly? Where I'm, just worried about some situation. And, you go back to those the high school journalism, newspaper advisor, whoever you had, or the professors you had, and that they still care about you even after you leave.
My college professor is Jerry Buckley. He was a bureau chief at Newsweek in Boston, and I called him, a year ago when I had a job offer and asked him to do it. So I still go back to those guys because I know they have my interest at heart. They were there when I didn't even have a byline, so they kind of understand what I've been through, and they've been through it themselves. So it's very easy to sort of talk to them.
Yeah, it's great to maintain those relationships over the years. So we'll just take a few more questions before we wrap up. Let's see, Christina asks, were you always interested in doing investigative journalism? Is it something that came later?
Yeah, it sort of evolved, like I said, it was good hours, and, I wanted to do something with a little bit more heft.
Nicole asks, where did you go to college, and did you feel the courses you took prepared you for the profession? Were you a Queens College person?
No, I went to Boston College.
Oh, that's right, Boston.
And I was an English major, And no, I took 1 or 2 journalism courses, so I wasn't really prepared. I did an internship at the college magazine, and I had done a 6-week program at Georgetown University in political journalism after. I don't know how I got it because I had 1 clip, I guess, I just had to fill a seat, but yeah, that was pretty much it. So, and I wrote probably 5 or 6 stories for the Boston College magazine, but that was it. I mean, I didn't have a master's degree. I went to work for the Queens Tribune, shortly after I graduated.
Okay. And we'll just take one final Twitter question, then I'll close out with you. Juliet says, is it difficult for you to remain neutral and impartial in the current political climate? I wonder about that sometimes too when you're interviewing sources, right? And you can see that they have a certain political leaning and maybe they try to engage you on that topic, especially now it's because journalism is so intertwined in this whole political controversy. So yeah, how do you handle it?
Yeah, I don't do a lot of very political stories, but I've definitely I've gotten nuclear power and that anti-nuke and that whole debate is entwined in what I do at Indian Point. So I've been called people one day they'll call me left-leaning, and I don't know and then I don't know how that came into play in a nuclear story about a nuclear power plant. But people will use those buzzwords to sort of attack you. But I try not to take the bait. If someone is saying, you're leaning this way or that way, I'll defend myself. Mm-hmm. I won't just let it go. You really can't. You really can't sort of, and you shouldn't. You should give everybody an opportunity to sort of make their case. Your politics shouldn't. I'm not very political anyway, so it's kind of easy. But your politics, shouldn't really come into play.
Yeah, I mean that's something that always struck me about you as a reporter, especially in the Daily News, where it was such a hectic kind of environment, and you have editors yelling at you very often, in addition to sources, in these kinds of high-pressure situations. But maintaining some sort of outward, I don't know if you do yoga or something like that, but this kind of outward idea of well, I don't need satisfaction from from the boss all the time, or from the colleague, or from the source, and that there's a bigger mission within you that keeps you confident and calm in those situations.
Yeah, I never. I try to realize that the people who love you are sort of the ones you really want their respect. I mean, work is work, and you try to have as much professional respect, but at the end of the day, I'm not. It's a story, and I go home. I wouldn't. A lot of people will. It's everything. The job is everything. It never was to me. I ran 3 miles today. Maybe that's how I relax. But you have to balance your life because the job will make great demands on you. So you need to keep that in mind. Is that you need to balance your life. You can't. They'll want you to work 14, 16-hour days, and you'll be no good to them at hour 8. So what's the point?
Yeah, well, and that's transitioning to the final kind of line of discussion I wanted to ask was about advice for student journalists and what they should do right now and then as they leave. And I think certainly for me, when I was interning at the Daily News, there was that pressure that you describe of they asked you, can you work tonight? And you already have something else you want to do that night, but you feel obligated, I got to say yes, even if I have this other thing planned, and you quietly cancel whatever it is, or they want you to work on weekends, holidays, and all that stuff, and always dangling out the hope that you might get hired or a promotion or something like that often never comes. But it is hard to say no.
Right.
So is that something that you think is knowing when to be enthusiastic?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's harder when you're young. I mean, you're getting pulled in so many different directions, and it's not just journalism. There's a lot of businesses that will want you to work more than you should. But yeah, you need to be a little bit stubborn. I mean, you can't say I'm not doing that because that doesn't really fly very well. But I mean, I think you need to keep in mind. You may work a 12-hour day today, but you're going to take a little bit on the back end, later on in the week because you just, after a while, you can't work that many hours. I mean, maybe you want to, but, And the other thing is, I think there's this idea that, once you get out of school, you have to have that great job, work in the city for a great, daily newspaper. But there's no rush, and I think that there can be a lot of fun in going to El Paso, Texas, and writing about, farms or whatever you write about in El Paso. I mean, you go on an adventure. Don't be stuck in this mindset that you need to get into the city and get to that big job. Learn the business. Learn how to do it well. Don't be in such a rush that you don't pick up the lessons.
And just to kind of close it out, talking about, again, what the student journalist can do, one of the things I've asked a lot of the reality check guests is, have you seen either students who have done a really good job, for example, as interns, or maybe just young reporters, fresh out of college, that there was a way that they acted or something that they did that was really good, or on the opposite side, things that definitely people should not be doing that they should know to avoid, that you've seen, again, from those younger journalists?
The best ones know how to listen. They don't come in and tell you how you're going to write this, how they're going to write this story, but they listen. I coach a baseball team, or at least I used to, and we always talk about kids being coachable, right? Well, that means when I tell you something, or when we have a conversation about it and you do it later, that means that you probably listened and you made an adjustment. So I think there's a lot to be, soaked up in a lot of these newsrooms. There's a lot of people willing to teach. There's a lot of us who are in newsrooms where people don't come to us and ask and say, hey, could you sit down and help me with this lead today? Because I'm really struggling with it. I remember when I started out, that conversation happened every day. Do you like this lead? Do you not like this lead? That doesn't happen as much anymore. And it's our fault too. The older reporters, we don't reach out as much. But you also need to, when you go into these places, don't be afraid, because people would love. I've been talking about what I do for how long we've been here, 45 minutes or longer. We love to talk about it because we've been at it a long time, and we're willing to share. And when you go into places, find somebody who's like that.
Yeah, and find people who are just as enthusiastic as you are. I remember I have a friend who used to be a longtime reporter and editor at the New York Times, Washington Post, other places, at the Daily News for a while. And he was saying that when he was in college, that the students would gather together at the restaurant, the bar, wherever, and they would debate AP style. Yeah. And they would talk about the news of the day and what do you think the Times had a better lead, or the Daily News?
Right.
It's hard to imagine students today really doing those kinds of things.
Well, I imagine they do. I imagine it's not in a bar. Thanks.
Right.
I imagine it's on
social
Twitter,
media.
on social media, and some of those habits we had weren't good.
Sure.
So I think there's probably a more productive way to doing those things.
Right. Sure. Any other final thoughts that you have about that you'd give to students?
That's what I said earlier is really make sure you get good at it. If you want to do it, make sure you don't be in a rush to get to the next level. Make sure you're good at it. Read every opportunity you have to read other people's stuff, and Connor mentioned earlier, mimic. I took a course in college in imitation, and you mimic how other people write so that you can kind of pick up their style and adapt it to your style.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Tom.
Thanks.